So it's my honor tonight to introduce a renowned environmental health expert and distinguished epidemiologist whom you might have heard interviewed yesterday on WNYC's Leonard Lopate show or last month on NPR's Fresh Air program with Terry Gross. Deborah Davis is director of the world's first Center on Environmental Oncology at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, and she's internationally known for her work as a researcher on the environmental causes of breast cancer and chronic disease. She holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and a Master's of Public Health from the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. From 1994 to 99, Dr. Davis served as President Clinton's appointee to the Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board, and as the senior advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Health in the Department of Health and Human Services, she counseled leading officials in the US, United Nations, World Health Organization, and World Bank. From 1983 to 93, Dr. Davis was scholar in residence and executive director of the Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology at the US National Research Council of the National Academy of Science. She's currently visiting professor in the Department of Environmental and Occupational Medicine at Mount Sinai Medical Center here in New York, and I could go on and on. But Dr. Davis is also, as you're about to hear, a highly accomplished science writer. She was a National Book Award finalist for her 2002 publication, When Smoke Ran Like Water, Tales of Environmental Deception and the Battle Against Pollution. And she's authored more than 170 publications. Her new book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, published last month, has been widely praised. In it, Dr. Davis argues, in a nutshell, that the appalling result of this country's misguided 30-year war on cancer has been more than 10 million preventable cancer deaths. One reviewer called the book grim but fascinating reading, and I can attest to that, as one of the book's very gripping but chilling chapters will appear in the next edition of the Academy's member magazine. So I want to thank Dr. Davis for joining us this evening. We want to give special thanks too to Perseus Books Group for offering copies of her book for sale here this evening. Your purchase will go to support the Academy. We'll have time for a short Q&A after the lecture. If you'd come to the microphone to ask your questions, since we're all being recorded, and then we'll have a reception and book signing. So please stay to join us for that, but welcome, Deborah Davis.
Good evening. The honor is mine, let me assure you. I'm really delighted to be here in this fabulous building and to see so many dear old friends and some new ones as well. I'm going to talk with you this evening about the secret history of the war on cancer, and I have to tell you a little bit about where I come from to set the context for that. I grew up in a town called Donora, Pennsylvania. How many of you have ever heard of Donora, Pennsylvania? Well, this is a very unusually well-informed group, at least 10%. Well, I want to show you what it looked like. This is an extraordinary image that was taken in 1910, and it shows this huge mill, which was 6 stories tall, that blocked out the river. And you see this little thing right here. This was a bucket from the blast furnace. It was put out back because a man had fallen in and been incinerated, and when that happened, and it did with some regularity, they would bury the bucket out back, his remains presumably inside, and the molten material as it hardened. People came to Donora because smoke meant jobs, and that's what they wanted in those days. We would go outside and play, and if you blew your nose, it would be black. Nobody thought much of it. Well, I only learned when I went away to school that something unusual had happened in Donora. In one 5-day period, 20 people dropped dead in Donora, Pennsylvania in 1948. I came home one day and I said to my mother, Mom, was there another town with the same name as ours? She got kind of quiet. Why are you asking? I said, well, I read in a book at school that a town called Donora was polluted. Now, pollution sounded like a dirty thing, so I thought it had to be someplace else. She said, well, you remember how we used to wash the walls down about once a month? I was tall, so I got to help early on. I said, yeah. Remember how we used to drive with the headlights on 2 in the afternoon because it's kind of dark often? I said, yeah. Well, she said, I guess today they would call that pollution. But back then, it was just a living. That's when I realized that I came from a somewhat unusual place, and I wrote about what it was like. You see here the hills opposite the zinc plant, the plume there, the smoke coming out of there, shows you what it was like on a typical day. That's not snow on those hills. Nothing grew much on them. Sometimes the graves would wash out of the ground. And we learned to live and play in an environment like that. In fact, it was great for a tomboy, because when you played kick the stick, you see kick the stick there, you could slide to first, second, and third base because there wasn't much grass under your feet. And when you went outside as a kid, you got what they called the Denora measles, sort of black, sooty stuff all over the place. Men would go to work with 2 white shirts if they had a white-collar job. And by noon, they'd have to change to the second shirt because the first one would be soiled. This is what Pittsburgh looked like in 1940 at noon. If you look carefully here, you can see it's daytime, right? But this is how dark it was. And that's what people expected was normal. This was the sign of prosperity. Pittsburgh became a leader in cleaning up the air. And what happened in Denora in 1948 ultimately led to the Clean Air Act, to a recognition that if a large quantity of pollution could kill some people, it killed 20 people in 5 days. It raised the question of what does pollution do the rest of us in a short period of time? So coming from Denora, I had a special appreciation, shall we say, of the long-term consequences of pollution for health. And I learned as well that the town I came from had been infamous in environmental history. I came from a famous place, I guess famous in the same way as Jack the Ripper or the Son of Sam. So it wasn't surprising that nobody ever talked about it there. Well, I've been now working as a cancer epidemiologist with some of the best and brightest people in the field for more than 20 years. And I began to try to write this book about 20 years ago, and I went to see my boss at the time, Frank Press, a very smart man who had been President Jimmy Carter's science advisor, who was the head of the National Academies of Sciences. Dr. Press had been very supportive of my career. He had encouraged me to publish analyses, some of which I published with the New York Academy of Sciences, some of which I published in The Lancet and Science and JAMA, showing that there was an increase in cancer that could not be explained by smoking or aging alone. And because of Dr. Press's support, I was able to do that work. So I was pretty excited when I went in to see him one day, and I said, Dr. Press, I have an offer to write a book. It has a kind of catchy title, Cancer Wars. Now remember Star Wars? I think it's still with us. Cancer Wars was a bit of a spoof on Star Wars, and I'd been offered a very handsome advance to write a book critical of the cancer enterprise for its failure to address the causes of cancer. Dr. Press listened, and then he said, it had better be a good book. I said, well, of course it's going to be a good book. I wouldn't try to write it otherwise. He said, it had better be a really good book. I didn't understand what he was getting at. I said, I don't understand. He said, well, I'm not telling you what to do. You're free to do whatever you want, but if you write a book critical of the cancer enterprise, given what's going on right now, you won't be able to work here when you finish. And you know, some people have read that passage in my book and interpreted it to mean that he was telling me I'll never eat lunch in this town again, or some variation on that. Well, in fact, he was giving me good advice, because it turned out that when I was thinking about writing this book, Cancer Wars, it was the dawn of what we now think of as the Reagan Revolution. And the last thing anybody wanted to hear about then was that there was an increased role for government and the private sector to clean up their act. This was the days when people thought that the last thing the government needed to do was to regulate anything. And as a consequence, during the Reagan Revolution, much of the effort to control the environment and, in fact, to protect workers from hazards in the environment was really undermined by things that happened at that time. We're still recovering from some of it. So I listened to Dr. Press. I didn't write the book then, but I am writing it now. And I'm now from Pittsburgh. and I'm now part of a major corporation. That would not have happened if I'd written the book at the time I first was thinking about it. The lessons of the book are very simple. If you want the future to be different from the past, you have to study the past. So the book is in part an exegesis of the history of science and medicine. It tells stories of things that many scientists are surprised to hear about. And I believe it shows that for a long time, in much of the war on cancer, we've been fighting the wrong war against the wrong enemies with the wrong weapons. Now, let me be clear. We've had tremendous progress in the war on cancer. There are 10 million cancer survivors today. That's a credit to what oncology has been able to do. Unfortunately, 1 million of them are under age 40, and no matter how efficient we may get at finding and treating cancer, and we're getting better at it, if we don't reduce the demand for treatment, we will never succeed in really reducing the toll of cancer on our lives. I talk about myself as a cancer orphan, and technically that's not correct, because I didn't lose my parents until I was an adult. But when my father, in his mid-50s, announced he'd lived a long life when he faced a diagnosis of multiple myeloma, that didn't seem fair at all. And I lost both of my parents to the disease at younger ages than I think I should have. In fact, this was my father at age 2, seated there in the family dry cleaning shop. The factory that cleaned the clothes was in the basement. There was a huge explosion there in 1923. My grandparents were using benzene to clean the clothes, and benzene was known to cause cancer in the 1920s. And I have records of that I've put on the website of the book, which you can find as well. Detailed archival information showing that scientists understood the dangers of benzene. Benzene is a remarkable solvent. It slices right through grease. It slices right through skin and bone. And that's one of the reasons why it's associated with an increase in a number of cancers, including the one that my father ended up developing when he was in his mid-50s. Now, those of you who know me well probably won't be surprised to learn that I am the daughter of a drill sergeant. My father actually was very patriotic, and he became a brigadier general, retired from many years of service, proud service to this nation. When he was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, we had no way to know what the causes were, but we do know there were many. Among them could have been the fact that he survived this explosion because my grandmother was able to get him out of that fire. And he was exposed at a very young age to high levels of benzene and other things. But he also worked as a teenager in the mills, like a lot of people did in Donora and Monongahela. He was very proud to have a mill job, and he had a job as a chemist at age 16. And he was a machinist by the time he was 18. Pretty heady stuff for a young man from such a small town. He went on to become a very successful businessman, but always worked with machines, and even when he was diagnosed with cancer, he still had a lathe in his basement and still worked with cutting oils and solvents and things to make candlesticks and things that we use to light the Shabbat candles, which I would be doing tonight if I were not here with you all. So my father was quite a character. My mother was an equal match. She was a remarkable survivor of many things. She survived 3 bypass surgeries, 3 major back surgeries, and 2 angiograms. And one of the things that I know now is that her survival of all of that surgery came with a certain price, because in the days that she had those surgeries, almost 30 years ago, the amounts of radiation that patients received as they were routinely monitored through that surgery was sufficient to cause cancer. And we now know that radiation can cause cancer, particularly diagnostic radiation, which may be medically appropriate and can save lives at times, can lead to an increased risk of cancer later on. Now I want to give you some of the evidence about why we know the environment is so important. These are the chromosomal bands of identical twins. As you all know, identical twins start out from one egg, splits in two, and they are as close to a clone as we have in human nature. At age 3, these chromosome bands of 1, 3, 12, and 17 here, from an article in the National Academy of Sciences Proceedings by Mario Fraga and colleagues, they have identical patterns pretty much of what's turned on and off. And you can see these patterns here just in the parallel images. But look at what happens to the chromosome bands by the time they are age 50. If you look at the bottom and top two, they don't even look like they're related to one another. Look very carefully. You might imagine they were from two unrelated people altogether. At age 3, they are close to identical, which is not surprising. This is telling us something very important. Genes are important determinants of cancer, but it's the interaction of the genes and the environment that determines whether or not cancer is going to develop. And lots of things happen, even in the case of identical twins, to influence how their genes change, how the chromosomes are altered over time, what tumor suppressor genes and oncogenes are turned on or off. All of those things reflect the complex factors in the environment to which we're exposed. I found this an amazing image because it was one of the first truly international scientific images. This is the hand of Frau Berta Röntgen, the wife of Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen, the man who discovered X-rays. She never again had another X-ray. She called them a death ray. I think it may have something to do with the fact that they never had children, that his lab was right over their bedroom, and he worked sometimes through the night, experimenting with these X-rays. When he took this picture, he knew he had something extraordinary, and he mailed it to several colleagues and to newspapers. And within a month, it was on the front page of newspapers in Paris and Tokyo and London. And people were holding X-ray parties. They were having the machines out within a few years of this, taking pictures of one another, watching their skeletons move. How many of you remember those X-rays that you used to take of your feet to fit your shoes when you were a child? Oh, I loved doing that. People had no idea in the beginning how harmful X-rays could be, or at least the public didn't understand that. But Thomas Edison did. His assistant, Clarence Daly, as far as I could tell, was one of the first people to die of radiation poisoning. First, he lost his arms. Burns never healed, and eventually he lost his life in 1904. Edison never had another X-ray again in his own life. Madame Curie as well, known for her phenomenal work in identifying polonium, a substance that was named for her native country of Poland, died of leukemia. Her notebooks were too hot to handle. That's how much radiation they had received. So the dangers of radiation were understood, and yet somehow that information didn't get to the rest of the world in a way to be as effective at limiting exposures. I was shocked, as I was doing the research for this book, to find this volume published in 1936 in Brussels by the Second International Congress of Scientific and Social Campaign Against Cancer, 1936. The world's leading scientists came by boat and train to Brussels, where they met for 2 weeks and reviewed all the evidence then known about things that caused cancer. And the kind of evidence that they looked at then was not limited to what we call today public health phenomena of humans in populations with large numbers and statistical significance. The evidence of what caused cancer in the 1930s was considered a combination of experimental findings in animals, clinical case reports, well-researched and documented of exposures and effects, and some statistical analyses of patterns of disease in people with unusual exposures. These are the things known in the 1930s to cause cancer. Diethylstilbestrol was actually synthesized back then, and it was used very early on to fatten cows and pigs. In fact, the Germans used diethylstilbestrol to fatten their animals, and they noticed that the boys who were making it were getting breasts and complaining because their breasts hurt. So they decided that they'd only have girls make it, because why would a girl object to having slightly larger breasts? They also understood the dangers of solar radiation, coal tars, benzene, and uranium mining. And look at this extraordinary drawing from 1936. It could be from something someone would have done yesterday. These are radiation-induced tumors from sunlight, from the work of Angel Honorario Roffo in Argentina. He headed up research on the dangers of tobacco in the 1930s. As we know from the work of Alan Brandt on the cigarette century, the dangers of tobacco were not suddenly become apparent in the 1960s. They were known for most of the 20th century, if not even earlier. And yet it was the development of the field of epidemiology as a discipline that had a paradoxical effect on what was considered evidence and proof of harm. It's quite an interesting thing to think about. Proof of harm has been defined, particularly by this administration, as enough sick or dead bodies amassed in a given point in time in a certain location with confirmed exposures that we can conclude that their illness was caused by a particular exposure. That's a pretty unusual way to think of it. What that means, though, is that if you have evidence like this, where every animal exposed to sunlight develops a tumor, you don't use that evidence to identify something that's a cancer risk for humans. The field of epidemiology I discuss in my book really grows up as a discipline around the issue of workplace dangers and tobacco. And it can't completely be separated from the economic forces that gave birth to it. And for those of you who are interested, I hope you'll read more about it in my book. It's a very, very fine dance that one does with respect to what is considered evidence. The epistemology of public health can't really be separated very easily from the economic environment in which issues emerge. Here's another example of that. This man, with the lighted match striking his pipe bowl, was the first director of the American Cancer Society, a position he held until 1954. He was a brilliant geneticist. He headed the Jackson Labs. He worked from the time he was a child breeding mice. He was an ardent advocate of eugenics, as were many, many American leaders. In 1954, he got kicked out, really, of the American Cancer Society, not because he advocated smoking. That was a position the American Cancer Society was very comfortable with for some time. He left the American Cancer Society in 1954 to become the leader of the Scientific Advisory Board of the Tobacco Industry Research Council. And in case you think this is just an unusual historic event, let me tell you about something that's happening right now in the state of Pennsylvania that I'm ashamed of, frankly, as a taxpayer. Behind closed doors, the Pennsylvania Senate is considering whether to weaken the legislation that has been passed to ban smoking in public places. Now, New York has done this way in advance under Republican leadership that should get a lot of credit for having understood the dangers of smoking in public places. Pennsylvania is still a little backwater. One of the reasons we are is that a fellow who worked for the American Cancer Society of Pennsylvania resigned his job for the American Cancer Society in 1993 to go to work for the tobacco industry in Pennsylvania in 1993. Plus sa chance. And what he did for the tobacco industry then, and what he's doing right now, is lobbying for the casino industry, arguing that you have to have smoking in casinos, so you better give some exemptions to controlling smoking in public places. In my book, I make it clear that this formula of trying to find the weak link in the argument and going behind the scenes and working with politicians to make it easy for people to continue to pollute, whether it's tobacco or asbestos, is a pattern that continues even to this day. When the National Cancer Act is signed in 1971, there's some really funny things that went on then, and there's transcripts of debates between Ted Kennedy and Richard Nixon about which one of them hated cancer more. You have to remember, the United States was not in a strong position. It was losing a war, a real one, in Southeast Asia. President Nixon was told that they would actually have cured cancer by the centennial. Can you imagine? Not too many scientists believed that. I was honored to have spent some time with Joshua Lederberg this week, and he told me he never thought that the cure for cancer was going to be an easy thing to find, and he always recognized how important it was to pay attention to the things causing cancer. But think about it. It's 1971. It's 7 years after the U.S. Surgeon General has declared that tobacco is a cause of cancer. It's 9 years after the Royal College of Physicians in England has said the same thing. And it's more than 20 years since 7 different scientific studies have all said tobacco is causing cancer and other health problems. And the president says, let's fight the disease, and is silent about tobacco, and silent about asbestos, and silent about benzene or radiation, all of which were known to cause cancer back then. That is why I say in my book, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, for much of the war, we've been fighting the wrong enemies. We need to focus our attention upstream at the things that cause cancer, rather than just improving our efficiency to find the disease and treat it. And as I said, the good news is we've gotten better at doing this. That's why I think breast cancer and prostate cancer, colorectal cancer, are declining. That's a good thing. But we need to figure out how to prevent cancer from happening in the first place. And that's going to take paying more attention to the things that we know cause it. Here was a cartoon by Herb Bloch in 1977 that I think expresses the realization that Dr. Lederberg and others had. If you could find a cure for cancer, it'd be a lot easier than prevention, don't you think? There were even people in the asbestos industry that tried to give workers a vitamin pill with their paychecks, because after all, if you could cure cancer, then it might not be so bad. Look, none of us is not interested in curing cancer, but we have to understand that the best way not to die of the disease is to keep yourself from getting it in the first place. And paying more attention to the things in food and drugs is going to be an important thing to do, although again, most recently in this administration, it's been claimed that they don't really need any more money, and they don't really need any more inspectors of food, and they don't really need any more inspectors of lead in children's toys. I think that those are positions that Americans may not all agree with. I know I don't. But in understanding why tobacco was such a tough habit to kick, you have to realize that the addiction to tobacco wasn't just a physical addiction. It was an economic addiction. The country depended on tobacco revenues, and doctors were among the biggest users of tobacco for a long time. So it was not that hard to get them involved. The American Medical Association worked for the tobacco industry well into the 1970s. And they issued a report in 1979 that's quite extraordinary, that I also have on the website for the book, saying in 1979, well, it looks like tobacco is bad for the lungs, but we're still not sure about lung cancer. It's kind of amazing to realize how long and firm the grip was on the nation's leading thinkers about tobacco. And the reason I talk about tobacco is because that is the model that is still operating today for other hazards, which I will come to in a moment. One story that has not been widely told is that the United States government spent more than $30 million to make a safe cigarette. Your taxpayer money went to make a safe cigarette. The head of the National Cancer Institute throughout the 1960s was a 4-pack-a-day smoker. It's kind of hard to imagine how you could smoke 4 packs a day, actually. I've interviewed some people who knew Dr. Endicott, and they said it was kind of interesting to watch what he would do when he went to the restroom, because he always would have one cigarette waiting, almost from the time he was awake. Ernst Winder, who did brilliant work on the dangers of tobacco, was an advocate of making a safe cigarette. And these fellows really had it wrong, as we know now. But it took a long time for that to become apparent. Hope is the most important drug we can give cancer patients. But look at this headline from Life magazine. 1958, fresh hope on cancer. The man who sent me this was an undertaker. The woman on the cover was his aunt. She died of metastatic cervix cancer. Cervix cancer was a death sentence in 1958 for many women. In my book, I disclose that it did not need to be a death sentence then, because in fact, scientists knew that the pap smear could find cells that were going to become malignant early and allow doctors to remove them. But the pap smear was not put into use. It was first invented in the 1920s by Dr. Papanicolaou. It was proven to save lives in a clinical trial in 1942, but it was not put into widespread use until the 1950s. And look at what happened as a result. In each one of these areas, you see the amount of cervix cancer at the time before the pap smear was put into use, indicated here, and then the drop in cervix cancer, which drops by at least 50% after the pap smear is being used. What was the fight about? Doctors feared that if you did pap smears, you would undermine the private practice of medicine. It would lead to socialism. It would lead to managed care. And there was a ferocious fight that went on within the American Cancer Society until Charlie Cameron, the scientific director, said, "These lives are on my conscience. You can't withhold this test any longer. We know it's going to save women's lives." Indeed, it did save lives, and it still does. But look what happened in England and Scotland. They did not implement pap testing until 1988. 1988. And you can see that they're the only 2 modern nations where incidence of cervix cancer did not fall. Rather amazing. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of data from further analyses that we are doing today with colleagues at the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences and our Center for Environmental Oncology at the University of Pittsburgh. And I refer to this in the book because cancer statistics are really complicated. But just because something's complicated doesn't mean it can't be understood at all. And what we've done is to try to sort out what is the change in cancer, taking out smoking and taking out screening-related cancers. We've done analyses, and what I'm going to show you here is this first number here is reflects the amount of cancer in people born in 1893 and the amount of cancer in that group and successive birth cohorts born in 1933, 1943, etc. And you see this remarkable decline in smoking-related cancers in men. This is the good news of cancer. I believe it could have happened a lot sooner if we'd acted on what we knew about tobacco. But look at cancers not related to smoking, and this excludes prostate cancer, which we think a lot of the increase in that is due to screening. You see here a continuing increase. This is showing you that there's 1.6 to 1.8-fold increased amount of cancer not related to smoking or screening in men in the United States. For women, smoking-related cancers have continued to increase, and you see that here. Breast cancer is still higher for women born in the 1960s and 70s than it was for their grandmothers, and cancers not related to screening or smoking are also increased in women. Now, these are patterns of disease in time and space. They can't tell you what the causes are, but when something changes relatively rapidly in a short period of time, you have to ask what's going on in the world around us to account for it. And in my book, I discuss how we know that there are environmental factors that we can do better with. Most of you may think that we've banned asbestos. We haven't. There's a bill sitting in Congress right now, and again, backdoor deals are being cut to weaken it. There's a bill to ban asbestos. EPA tried to ban asbestos, and it was thrown out by the courts. The Congress has tried to ban asbestos this year, and there are efforts to weaken that approach right now. The United States and Canada stand alone in the modern world for not having banned asbestos. Canada is exporting asbestos to India as I speak, and in India, young girls and boys are working with it, and we know what the consequences will be. In the book, I show the images of what happens to people who sometimes do nothing more than comb the hair for 20 years of people who are exposed to asbestos. Christy Todd Whitman, the EPA administrator, tried to launch a national campaign to warn 35 million Americans that there's asbestos in their attics now, in insulation in the form of zonolite, contaminated with tremolite from Libby, Montana, a beautiful town, now also famous like Denora for environmental infamy. Massive contamination of Libby, Montana has been well documented. Pulitzer Prizes have been won by the reporters who've confirmed this. And yet the problem goes on. When Christy Todd Whitman tried to launch this national campaign, the Office of Management and Budget refused to let her do so. If you know enough to look at the EPA website today, you can find information about this problem, but you have to know how to look. You have to ask. And a Chinese proverb says, a way of looking is a way of not looking. And if you don't allow people to look, if you don't set a public discussion and information, there's no possibility for learning about these hazards. And this is a fixable hazard that does require professional attention to deal with it. Not all asbestos should be removed. Sometimes it should be left alone. But asbestos in attic insulation of the sort I'm talking about here is precisely the kind that does release millions of particles into the air, and where young homeowners might go in to fix a wiring problem in their attic and be exposed to something that 30 or 40 years later could cause them to develop a crippling, lethal lung disease. In my book, I talk about the fact that mesothelioma, which is a suffocating tumor of the lung that killed Stephen Jay Gould, mesothelioma today occurs in people who've never had any history of working with asbestos. 1 in 3 people who develop mesothelioma in many countries today have never worked with asbestos. Well, guess what was in the Kent filter cigarettes? Micronite, crucidolite asbestos, was the filter for Kent cigarettes. We had a lot of interesting uses for asbestos that we only are now fully appreciating. And that's one of the reasons I wrote my book. Now, we're often missing information, and I want to show you examples of why we're missing information. Some people say, what's the proof? What's the beef? Why are you worrying about silly little risks like this? After all, you can't show me any people that ever really have been harmed by the environment. Well, you know what? They're right. It's hard to show environmental harm. Life is a mixture, and the real environment that we live in is complicated. But here's an example of a town that was so polluted the citizens were able to get a lawyer, even though they were poor and black in Louisiana, and go to the factory and argue that the levels of pollution in their backyards were so high that they ought to be compensated. Well, they were. They were paid to move. And this is what the town looks like today. It's gone. There is no town. There are no data. The absence of evidence of harm here should not be misconstrued as proof that there is no harm. Rather, it's a reflection of the complex political and economic realities in which we live. Here's another town that I visited. This is all that's left of Mossville, Louisiana. The painted names on these placards. All of them can't be read. All of them died in Mossville. People lived there for 5 generations, hunting and fishing and living off the land. The beautiful bayous of Louisiana that I describe in the book, amazing areas, but the people of Mossville, they got used to some unusual things called sheltering in place. There'd be huge explosions, and they'd be told to stay in their homes and close the windows. One woman I interviewed told me she saw swamp devils. I said, I don't want to be disrespectful here, but you saw swamp devils? She said, look, when you're a 9-year-old girl running for your life out of your home in your bedclothes through the swamp, and there's water moccasins and alligators out there, you betcha there's swamp devils out there. Well, these people got together, and their town was moved as well. The CDC actually has done a study of the blood of the ones who are still alive, and they've actually found some very high levels of dioxin there. But again, it's not proof of anything because we don't have a large enough population to have a statistically significant result to show an effect. And again, the absence of evidence in these situations should not be misinterpreted as proof that there isn't a problem. Here's another one where the only thing left in the town of Smeltertown is the cemetery. I visited here. If it wasn't a cemetery, it would be a hazardous waste site. The levels of metals in the ground are so high. For more than a century, toxic dusts from Sarco's idled smelter in the town named Smeltertown went across the canals. The Rio Grande is really a great big ditch at that point, concrete, and very seldom has any water in it much of the year. According to a memo released recently, this smelter was conducting sham recycling. The memo, the author of the memo is the U.S. Department of Justice. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, the Sarco smelter was responsible for sham recycling. They would take industrial waste from all over the country and burn them, claiming to be recycling them. But it wasn't really recycling, and as a result, the levels of pollution that went up into the plume and spread around the area were quite high. This is another example of the sorts of problems. Dead men don't tell tales, but the graves in those cemeteries are pretty interesting. A lot of them are children. They were found to have very high levels of lead in these children in the 1970s, and I explain that I studied this problem in 1980, and I thought it was a problem of the past when I studied it then. For the Congressional Research Service, the Environmental Law Institute, where I was scientific director, did a study in 1980. I was astonished to go back there after I wrote my other book and to find that the problems of Sarco were not over. They'd just been transformed. And now the company is claiming they want to restart this 150-year-old smelter. Because if they claim they want to restart it, they can avoid having to clean it up. This is one of those graves I mentioned, a 2-year-old, 2 years and 4 months. These are the graves of the poor. That soil is blackened with lead. Now I want to return to a modern problem. I alluded to it when I talked about my mother's experience with diagnostic radiation. The American College of Radiology just this year has issued a white paper on radiation dose in medicine. Many of you who are interested in radiation physics may be aware that we don't have a standard way of calculating radiation dose right now for CT scans. But the white paper from the American College warns that the current use of medical diagnostic radiation in the U.S. today is about equivalent to the worldwide releases of the catastrophe at Chernobyl, which was more than 400 Hiroshimas. The Chernobyl releases were multiple releases over a long period of time. And the American College of Radiology is calling for reducing the use of unnecessary diagnostic radiation. Here's a calculation based on data from the National Cancer Institute of the amount of chest X-ray equivalents involved in pediatric CT scans of the head. of babies. If it's unadjusted for the size of the head, you can get between 400 to 6,000 chest X-ray equivalents. Now, you all understand that a CT scan is not one X-ray, it's dozens to hundreds. And in the pediatric world, the repeated use of CT scans of the abdomen and the head is something that really does need to be controlled. And the pediatric community is aware of this. That is, the radiologists are aware of it. We at the University of Pittsburgh are working with leaders in the American College of Radiology now to bring more public awareness to this on the part of physicians who run the emergency rooms. Now, let me be very clear. If your child is unconscious and has a head bleed, you may need a CT scan for your child. But these CT scans are being used for many conditions where it's not an emergency and not considered as necessary. And there are alternatives, such as magnetic resonance imaging and ultrasound, that sometimes can be useful. And the decision about what to do, of course, must be made by the health professional involved in managing any patient. But most doctors in the emergency room who order these CT scans themselves, according to a recent study at Yale University, which I cite in my book, do not understand the risks. And one of the fastest growing segments of the population with increased cancer are people aged 20 to 40. There are now 1 million cancer survivors under the age of 40. Lance Armstrong is probably the most famous of them. He's not alone as a testicular cancer survivor, because testicular cancer has almost doubled or grown 50% in every industrial country. Whether or not radiation plays a role for the increased cancers in young people today, I don't know. But I do know this. If you had Hodgkin's disease before age 16 and received radiation to the chest, your Hodgkin's disease will be cured. But by the time you reach age 40, 1 in 3 women will have breast cancer. 1 in 3 will have breast cancer by the time they reach age 40 if they've received radiation to the chest before age 16 for Hodgkin's disease. Because Hodgkin's disease radiation therapy in the past was much higher dose. Now, the good news is the radiation therapists have figured out how to lower the dose now for treating Hodgkin's disease. But in the past, it clearly created problems. As a result of all of this, the American College of Radiology is recommending that we license CT technologists and test and train them. And guess what? We don't. Now, in my hospital at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, which actually covers many buildings and in many states and several countries, we have state-of-the-art training of our technologists, as I'm sure most major New York hospitals do. But you've seen the ads. Come get a whole-body CT scan in a shopping mall. What certification and standards and training is there? And people are finding things, I call them imaginomas. They're finding things, particularly on the thyroid, that nobody knows what they mean. We need a national database of radiation doses. We need improved training, not only of the technologists, but of the pediatricians and emergency medicine docs. The pediatric radiology community is warning that we've got to stop ordering so many unnecessary tests in children and adults. And the ironic thing is, as you may know, you get fabulous quality images the higher the dose of radiation you use. It's an extraordinarily beautiful technique, but we need to realize that it may come as a Faustian bargain in some circumstances. Now, just to change the mood a little bit, I wanted to show you Donald Rumsfeld. Now, what does he have to do with the war on cancer? Well, it turns out, in 1977, the General Counsel of the FDA sought a grand jury indictment of the G.D. Searle Company for submitting fraudulent data on the safety of aspartame. The indictment never happened. I tell the details in my book. In 1977, the same year the indictment is filed, the company hires Rumsfeld. I don't think he was hired for his expertise in pharmacology. But in 1981, the day after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, the Searle Company filed for approval of aspartame. Every single scientific group that had ever reviewed the data on aspartame for the FDA said, no way, this should be approved. There was no dissent. 1981, it was a new day. Remember? The beginning of the Reagan Revolution. Within 5 months, aspartame was approved. Now I want to show you data that was just released today. How's this for topical? We can put this link on the websites as well. Bear with me while I explain this. Aspartame has been studied by the Ramazzini Foundation in Italy. This is a distinguished testing laboratory that has been in existence for close to 30 years, has tested many modern hazards. And this study looked at the age at death of animals, and they studied several thousand rodents, and they studied them with prenatal exposure and postnatal exposure. Some of the animals began to be exposed when their rodent mothers were pregnant. And they measured at what age the animals died and what amounts of tumors occurred in the animals. So you see here in the postnatal exposure, which means the animals are exposed only after birth, but the animals were allowed to live 3 years. Now, those of you who do toxicology understand that a typical animal bioassay, animals are sacrificed at 2 years. That would be killing people at my age, equivalent to 60. They kill the animals. If the animals are allowed to live to the 3rd year, they're approximating the lifetime that most of you are going to reach in this room, which is your 80s and 90s. And if you do that, you see here that the levels of tumors that are found in the prenatally exposed animals are up to 30% of all of them will have tumors, compared to your control animals, this is your control animal here, which is 10%. And here you see the difference in postnatal exposure. You have 5% tumors in the control group, and here you have 15% tumors. Let's translate that a little bit, okay? Prenatal aspartame exposure nearly doubles the cancer rate in adult rodents compared to postnatal exposure. Now, what about epidemiology? After all, we're not rats. Well, we're not. But we differ from them by a lot fewer genes than people think, perhaps 300. Recent epidemiologic studies have not found any risk at all of cancer. But let's talk about what those studies did. They looked at people age 55 and did a survey and asked them when they were 55, do you use aspartame? And then 5 years later they said, do you have brain cancer? Now, I'm not making this up. This is what they really did. But you're snickering because you can see how ridiculous this is. We know that brain cancer, like many forms of cancer, can take 10, 20, 30, or 40 years to develop. It can. So asking people whether they used aspartame when they were 55 years of age and seeing whether or not they had brain cancer 5 years later isn't really the most rigorous approach to the question, I would say. The reality is today more than 200 million people are regularly consuming aspartame. And let me make sure you understand something about the levels that were used here. 2,000 parts per million is about 5 cans of soda and maybe 2 yogurts with aspartame a day. Okay? That's not a lot of aspartame. And again, look here. This is really important for you to see that if you killed these animals at 2 years, you wouldn't see necessarily a statistically significant difference in the amount of tumors here. But when you let the animals get out to 3 years of life, which is where we all hope to get, equivalent to our 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, then you see these incredible increases in tumors. And that's why I think it's time to take another look at this compound. Because if the US FDA were to conclude that exposure to aspartame causes cancer in rodents, the agency would have to revoke its approval. Well, now I want to turn to some of the good news. Green is the new black. The University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, where I work, is going green. Now, we're a very large institution. You know those ads you see in the New York Times? We cover a large area, 6 states and I think more than 4 countries, and we have more than 400 different buildings. We're going green. That means we're changing the way we clean, the way we operate, the kinds of energy we use. We're changing our plastics to safer forms of plastic. And we're doing it not because we know it's going to reduce cancer, but because we know it's going to be more efficient and it's going to reduce the probability, or it's going to reduce the chances that cancer and other diseases will happen. It's going to mean that we're more responsible citizens to our surrounding community. NYU is purchasing 100% of its energy from wind. The world is going green. The fashion world, green is the new black. In the business world, in American business, as Tom Friedman has written, green is the new red, white, and blue. And ultimately, it's going to mean less cancer and more health for all of us. Now, I close with these polar bears because they're beautiful, but because they also send us all a message. The polar bears are in trouble. Now, you probably can figure out that polar bears are not really well designed to jump. Like white men, polar bears can't jump. They've got this huge rump, and they're really not very aerodynamic. They're jumping because they're trying to find ice to hunt from in the Arctic summer. And they're not doing too well. This is a magnificent photo taken by Thomas D. Mangelson, a friend of mine who's a world-renowned wildlife photographer. These polar bears are running out of ice to hunt, and fewer of them are surviving. Now, the other thing you may not know about them is that 1 in 100 in the most recent survey is a hermaphrodite with male and female genitals. And they are showing up with carcinogens in their fat that would qualify them for burial in a hazardous waste site. Now, how do these carcinogens get into polar bears? They don't work in factories. Well, you remember the movie The Lion King? And there's this scene where the Lion King lead character is depressed. And the monkey says to the parrot, "What's eating him?" And the parrot says, "Nothing. He's at the top of the food chain." The polar bear is at the top of the food chain in the Arctic. And at the top of the human food chain is the nursing infant. So the polar bear is a symbol of the global circulation of pollutants. And what's going on now is a global phenomenon where the business community understands, whether it's global warming or toxic chemicals, that policies have to be addressed globally. And unfortunately, the United States may lose its competitive edge in chemicals because of programs like the European Union's REACH program, Registration, Evaluation, and Assessment of Chemical Hazard, which is stipulating that chemicals must be proven to be safer before they're put into products that we're all exposed to. In the book, I talk about one example of this, a 1,4-dioxane, which causes cancer in male and female rats and mice, and is banned in Europe, and yet we allow it. So my grandchildren might be exposed to this chemical in their shampoo and bubble bath, but if they were in Europe, their bottoms would not be endangered. That doesn't make any sense, and I think people know that, and the American chemical industry understands it. So they're now asking for more standards to be more uniform, because it's not going to help them if we fail to meet the world standards with respect to safety and chemicals. Now I want to show you Pittsburgh today. This is where we are. These are all real buildings. They look almost like a dream. We have the world's largest green convention center. We have the world's largest green greenhouse. It has an earth tube under it, which goes down in the ground, and in the summer, the air is cooled by going through the ground, and in the winter, the air is heated by going down through the ground. It is no net energy. It's self-sufficient in the green greenhouse. We are one of the centers of green buildings. Our hospital is going to be building a green children's hospital, and we're leading the way to understanding how we can do more with less toxic materials for buildings and for operations in medicine and in healthcare. Sometimes people say to me, you know, you must be crazy if you think you're going to do all of these things. And I think the answer is no, you can't do all of these things. None of us can. But I take comfort from a message of a Rabbi Tarfun, which is a story in the Talmud. My modern variation of it goes like this. A group of workers are told, look, you got to finish. There's a job here. It's really big. It's really complicated. And you got to do it. And they say, what, are you crazy? We don't have the right tools. It's impossible. And we'll never get it done. And the reply is, it's really not up to you to finish the task, but you must begin it. Thank you. All right. I'll be glad to take any questions. There's a microphone here. I also want to take a moment and introduce two people. Leon Bradlow is a hero of mine. Dr. Bradlow has done important work that I think will lead us to new frontiers, and we're hoping that our researchers at the Center for Environmental Ecology are following in this, where he has identified metabolites of estrogen and markers in the blood and urine that we think will predict risk so we can intervene. And his work has been phenomenal. Would you mind to stand, Leon, so we can give you a round of applause? I want to thank you very much. All right. Barbara Seaman is one of the people we should have listened to years ago. In 1969, she first warned in the American audience about the dangers of hormones for our health. And it was only, of course, when the U.S. government confirmed that Barbara Seaman was right that finally people began to act. I want to point out something, though. You know, breast cancer has started to fall a lot. And if, in fact, the decline in breast cancer is associated with women stopping to use hormone replacement therapy, if it is, that's good news for all of us. Because it's saying that years of exposure to a promoting agent like hormones can reverse the harm if you stop using the exposure. What that means for the rest of us is that ceasing exposure to promoting agents, to epigenetic materials such as have been documented on the recent Nova documentary, can be very valuable and very important for us to do. So I wish we'd listened to Barbara Seaman before, but now she's celebrated in the same medical circles that used to blackball her. Thank you. All right. Barbara. Thank you. Questions or comments? And you please identify yourself. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Marshall. No microphone. I'm Marshall. A question about asbestos and hormones. What studies have been done regarding the impact of asbestos on, you mentioned mesothelioma. Has that definitely been proven, and how many cases have there been? That's number one. And number two, as far as hormones, which hormones in regard to, I guess, replacement therapy have been shown to be dangerous or disastrous, and which ones have not been, if any?
All right. Well, a mesothelioma and its association with a number of forms of asbestos has been very well established, unfortunately, in the human literature over many years. And I have a lot of references in the book that can provide information on that.
Cases of this happening?
Oh, yes, many. Many. Now, with respect to hormones, I think I'll ask Barbara to tell us the latest. There are some people who believe that there's a difference between bioidentical hormones and synthetic hormones, but there's really no reason to think that's the case. And the studies have been done on different combinations of progesterone and estrogen, and there are studies in England which have found that even if you don't use combined hormone replacement therapy, you're still getting an increased risk. And the risk for hormone replacement therapy is the following. You have a risk of breast cancer, you have a risk of deep vein thrombosis, you have a risk of blood clot, you have a risk of heart attack. And there doesn't seem to be any long protection even against dementia, which they thought there would be. So all of the things that hormone replacement therapy was supposedly going to protect you against, at this point, the only one that there may be some evidence for is bone loss. But think about the idea of this. You're going to take a drug starting in your 50s to prevent a disease, namely osteoporosis, that typically affects women in their 80s. And so as a result, you're going to give yourself a risk of chronic cancer to protect yourself against a disease that may happen 30 years down the road. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why many of us were concerned about this all along. Barbara, do you want to add anything to this? Use the microphone, please.
One of the interesting things that we...
You have to pull the thing down to your right.
It's as if the human female...
Is it on? Louder.
There's an interesting situation with the human female body and the combinations of the hormones, because if you have estrogen and you add the progestin to it, it protects your uterus, and you're much less likely to get endometrial cancer, but it increases your risk of having breast cancer. So it's as if you have to choose between down below or up above. And that's about where we are now. We haven't gotten far enough to do anything further. But I'd like to say that your book is really, to me, the most important book on science and health that I've seen in this century. That's for the last almost 8 years. And it's a very engaging book. It's very hard to put it down, except that at times it's so disturbing that you put it down. And it's a great read. And I think in the end, people will feel liberated from it, not being terrified. But while you're reading it, there are times where you're terrified. And I think people should prepare for that. And I'm also very concerned. For many years, I was blackballed because of my concerns about hormone products. All told, I lost columns at 5 different women's magazines when the advertisers moved in and were able to make a deal about ads and getting rid of my columns. But I feel that you covered so many things and so deeply. I mean, I thought I knew all about the studies on estrogen in the 1930s. You found another several times more that I had never even found. You have a way of talking to people, of looking at the historic records, looking at the epidemiologic findings. I think it would be nice if you could tell us a little more about how you managed to bring all these things together. But I am worried, and I want to say to everybody in the audience that you deserve to be protected now. I have heard signs already of people who are. It's called bringing doubt into the question, and that's a very well-known way that the people in these commercial who are going to lose money. That's a very terrible way that they're using it. And I want to call attention to an article that was in the Scientific American called Doubt about 2 years ago. It was by David Michaels, who's also an epidemiologist. He happens to be my stepbrother, too. But and he has a book coming out on this topic of doubt. And I think that anybody who finds herself or himself being moved on or off, should they take Deborah's findings seriously, ought to read this material on how doubt works, because that'll give you an underpinning in staying the course with what Deborah is telling us. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Well, I feel protected. I've got my husband here, and And also, it's a different time. I'm working for a different place right now, and as I say in the book, a lot more people who are working on cancer themselves have cancer. And I think cancer is really not an unusual political issue. The Republicans and Democrats all get cancer, and I think people understand now that we've got to make some big changes. So I'm hoping that what my Bubby used to tell me is still true, that when you have nothing to stand on, you can always stand on the truth. And I admit there's things we don't know. I certainly know the epidemiology on many of these things, like aspartame. The epidemiology says there's no problem. It has absolutely nothing to do with what's going to happen to children, today. And I hope your concerns are not any more pertinent, but I know what you went through, and we'll find out at this point. Almost all the support for my center is coming from private foundations headed by women, by the way. And we are supported through major foundation grants, though, from Teresa Heinz and the Heinz Endowments, and the Highmark Foundation, and recently from the Winslow Foundation, from Renworth, and others. And we expect to expand our purview to get that kind of support, because I think it's women who understand these issues first and foremost. And I think that there may be a change in the government coming, and then things will look a little differently for all of us. Thank you for your concerns. Yes, sir.
Is there any good data on the incidence of cancer among chemists who are exposed on a regular, everyday basis to?
Yes, there are. There's excellent data showing that chemists have an increased risk of a number of forms of cancer. Women chemists have an increased risk of breast cancer. Men chemists have an increased risk of lymphoma and leukemia. And it's not surprising because, as Dr. Bradlow told me, if you trained in chemistry back in the old days with mouth pipetting, without hoods, without gloves, you were obviously exposed to risks. And it's not surprising that those who are still around, who trained in the old days in chemistry, have incurred some risks from their work.
I ask that because I haven't seen that among many chemists that I know, and one would expect something like that.
Right. Well, it's always dangerous to talk about the people that you know, but in fact, in a study in Shanghai found that women Chinese chemists obviously had a 14-time higher rate of breast cancer compared to others. So there is a literature on it. And again, I think the question of epidemiology has to always be framed as part of a larger whole. What does the epidemiology tell us? But what do we know from the animal data? And let's put it all together, rather than what we have had done here in this administration, which is to say, we don't have epidemiologic evidence, and as David Michaels will say in his new book, which I'm looking forward to reading, doubt is manufactured. The absence of evidence becomes used like a cross held up to the vampire. We're uncertain. We don't have information, so we better do nothing and say nothing. And I think that's the wrong approach to take in the modern world. So thank you for your question. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. I was wondering if you could tell me how the recent stem cell research that's been done over the last 10, 15 years has affected the way we think about, or the premise of cancer therapeutics.
Well, cancer therapeutics is really poised for a revolution in immunology and understanding of the process of cancer. I have a chapter in the book that explains that the old approach to chemotherapy came out of poison gas warfare. Poison gas warfare, it was a fascinating little story, actually. An astute Army doc in the First World War figured out that the people who had survived poison gas attacks had almost no white cells. Right? They had almost no white cells. So he figured out that people who had leukemia, who were full, had too much white cells. They were called white blood was the name. Weissblut, and leukemia was the Latin translation from the German Weissblut, white blood. So he figured out that if you could take the same agent that had created no white blood cells in these poison gas survivors and give it to people who had leukemia, maybe you could treat them. And the first treatments were in fact developed, and they were done as classified secret army research during World War II and prior to it. So the scientists who were doing this work didn't even know what materials they were injecting in people. And it was this classified use of poison gas. The new paradigm of cancer therapeutics is totally different. We are no longer just killing the cancer. We're boosting the immune system. We're taking the body's natural defenses. We're finding agents in natural products, like the work that we're trying to do at our center with broccoli extracts or things from yogurt or garlic or fish oil or chocolate or red wine. A lot of interesting things you can do there. And we're using these things to boost the immune system, to boost repair, to enhance the body's capacity to fix itself. And that, I think, is where the modern paradigm has moved. And it's making, there really is a lot of progress. At the same time, we have to make progress at the other end, which is making fewer cases of cancer. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. You gave us various examples of business interests subverting the public interest and of conflicted advocacy groups such as the AMA and American Cancer Society. Can you give us examples of advocacy groups that you see out there doing good work, raising these difficult issues? And quickly, would you drink the Diet Coke waiting us in the reception? And do you have any thoughts about nuclear power in terms of exposing people to cancerous products and whatnot? Thank you.
Thank you for such a simple question. Well, first of all, the American Cancer Society today is one of the most effective anti-tobacco groups in the world, right? So better late than never. And so they have done a great job on that issue. They need to do a better job on the environment, and they need to do a better job in supporting basic research, because only $1 in $10 that they raise actually supports independent basic research. Most people don't know that. The American Cancer Society has done a lot of good things when it comes to publicizing cancer and getting information out about the dangers of smoking. Organizations that are doing a better job today getting information to people include the Breast Cancer Fund, Breast Cancer Action, the Environmental Working Group, that are documenting a really broad array of things that need to change. You may not think that agricultural policy affects cancer, but believe me, it does. And there are groups out there understanding this issue. You may not think that climate policy or energy policy affects cancer, but believe me, it does. In fact, let me just show you one example. This is a proposed tower that's going to be built, cutting across a swath of West Virginia, Virginia, Maryland, all right? These towers are as high as a 15-story office building. What has that got to do with cancer? Well, in order to fuel the energy, the electricity for those towers to run, they're going to have to beef up using dirty coal-fired power plants that were supposed to be mothballed until they got a new lease on life under this administration. And these dirty coal-fired power plants release a lot of pollutants which are direct carcinogens and others that worsen the environment. So we have to start recognizing that energy policy is really public health policy as well. Now, nuclear power, I think nuclear power is a great idea. I just wish it worked. And what I mean by that is that the nuclear industry does not have a good track record. If nuclear power could be made to be safe and proven to be safe, it would make a lot of sense. I'm concerned, though, that the life cycle costs of uranium mining, of building the power plants, of operating them, and the releases that have occurred most recently in Japan just last year create a record that suggests it's going to be very difficult for the nuclear power industry to live up to the possibility of being the clean form of energy that it could become. David? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Tom Lewandowski at Brooklyn College. Very nice talk.
Thank you.
And I just had a comment and then a question. The comment was that the examples you've cited for the chemicals and potential cancer causes tend to be those sort of chemicals that we all know about, lead, dioxin, things like that, that are very scary. And one thing that you didn't mention, and that perhaps is in your book, are the chemicals that are now coming into the environment through the use of pharmaceuticals, for example, things that get flushed down the toilet and then we all end up drinking. And they get into the environment. And unlike things like dioxin, which are sort of perhaps weak estrogens, we're talking about things that are intentionally designed to be estrogenic. So just something I think to be aware of. And the question actually relates to the difference between the medical community and the public health community. And can you comment about how that affected the evolution of the war on cancer, and whether maybe the medical community with its focus on treatment rather than prevention was a major factor there? Thanks.
Well, thank you. That's a very, very thoughtful question. And let me say that you're absolutely right. The medical approach necessarily looks at the individual patient, the individual organ, the individual disease. The public health approach necessarily looks at the patterns that individuals make arrayed in time and space, and how their diseases might reflect the different things they've experienced throughout their lives. And that fundamental difference of focus is, in fact, part of the legacy that we have to deal with now with the war on cancer. The war on cancer starts as a medical war with the germ theory of disease, which, after all, is premised on the notion that you find the germ and you attack it. Pasteur's dying words are relevant here. Pasteur, of course, is credited with having developed the germ theory of disease, with having understood that the pox was transmitted infectiously from milkmaids who were immune to it, but was transmitted to others, and that infectious transmission was due to the germ. Okay? He understood the germ theory, in fact, the varicella zoster. His dying words, though, were, remember the host. Remember the host conditions. And I think that is what's going to lead to a new paradigm in medicine today that many of my colleagues at Pittsburgh are actually adopting. Dr. Judy Balk, Dr. Mark Hyman, Max Eisenberg at Harvard, Freddie Cronenberg at Columbia. They're all starting to ask, let's not just treat the disease, let's find out what's in the body of the person who has the disease. And we are hoping to develop quality-controlled tests for measuring metals so that we can measure white cell counts, which we need to know, and metal levels, and then understand what could be the contribution of environmental factors to someone's poor health, along with the things that we've traditionally looked at. But you're absolutely right. The medical model looks at individuals and individual organs and diseases. The public health approach looks at the patterns, and it's combining those now that will get us the best solution. David?
In a way, you're already addressing what I was going to ask about, which was the relation of cancer and infectious disease, and in a way, in terms of public policy for infectious disease. Of course, we want new antibiotics, and someone is ill, you'd like to treat them as infected, but of course, water purification and wash your hands and things like that. So I'm kind of interested in the balance, I suppose, and how you look at the way that public policy and the way that medicine in terms of treating infectious disease, and now people are very concerned about infectious disease sometimes in the context of emerging infections, HIV, so something very new, or biological terrorism is a possibility, and it gives all of this sense of environmental monitoring. And yet there's also new emphasis on trying to get new antiretrovirals, let's say, or renewed interest, or the crossover that you didn't deal with when you mentioned pap smears and so on, that now with the HPV vaccines, in fact, that with an infectious disease model, which is something completely different than the pollution model you've been discussing, but that also gives rise to epidemic kind of epidemiology, so it's a very interesting complementary other ideas. So I ask you just to contrast this infectious disease model and the way they're being considered now with cancer.
Well, I want to thank you for that question about infectious diseases and cancer. And let me just say that, in fact, some cancers may very well have a viral etiology. And human papillomavirus is not just relevant to cervix cancer, which we know it is. It's relevant to laryngeal cancer as well. It's relevant to anal cancer. And I'm going to read you a little bit about the vaccine issue. Scientists have now developed a vaccine that prevents the major forms of HPV infection from taking root in the first place. Trials have shown promising results. It was first tested on fewer than 20,000 women between the ages of 15 and 25. It's being recommended and may be required in pre-teenage girls, none of whom was in this trial, right? Despite the a lack of experience with this vaccine in young girls, the CDC recommends that 11 and 12-year-old girls be vaccinated against HPV, much as they are vaccinated against polio, diphtheria, and typhoid. But what about boys? Why are we prepared to vaccinate young girls but not young boys who can spread it? There actually are good reasons to think that vaccinating boys would prevent anal cancer in those that are gay, and could also reduce heterosexual transmission from men to women, might reduce the risk of head and neck HPV-related cancers. Groups are organized to protect the purity of young girls, and they are incensed. Not surprisingly, none of them is expressing concerns about the health of gay men or prospects for reducing laryngeal cancer. Instead, it's argued that vaccinating against HPV will open the door to wanton sexual behavior among girls because, among other things, they will need not to think about whether they might contract cancer in 30 years. I've got news for them. With 2 out of every 3 girls having sex by age 18, and with close to half of them not necessarily willing participants on each occasion, it makes little sense to suppose that decisions about sexual activity are based on the possibility of getting cancer in middle age. I am concerned about the HPV vaccine because it hasn't been fully tested, and I think that we often implement programs in the United States without looking at their long-term consequences. But you are right, there is a clear, interesting interaction between infectious diseases and cancer, and there are certain viral conditions that promote cancer. Epstein-Barr virus and aflatoxin exposure in Africa are thought to increase the expression of aflatoxin-related hepatocellular carcinoma. And in hepatitis B vaccine, there's now some trials in China using hepatitis B vaccine to see if we can reduce the transmission of hepatocellular carcinoma as well. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity there for fertile, to make a pun, exchanges. But I want to leave you with this thought from Kata Pollitt of The Nation. I remember when people rolled their eyeballs if you suggested that opposition to abortion was less about life than about sex, especially sex for women. You have to admit that thesis is looking pretty solid these days, no matter what the consequences of sex, pregnancy, disease, and death. Abstinence for singles is the only answer. Just as it's better for gays to get AIDS than use condoms, it's better for women to get cancer than have sex before marriage. It's honor killing on the installment plan. It's one way of looking at the issue. Yes, sir. I think we'll take this last question.
Would you comment on the effort to rehabilitate DDT currently, where they are saying that the original testing was flawed and DDT saves more people than kills and things of that nature?
Yeah. It's a sad day for all of us that the science here has become so heavily politicized and perverted. I'm sorry it's the last question. I could spend 40 minutes talking about it, but let me just say this. In Mexico, they eliminated malaria without DDT by basic industrial hygiene programs involving bed nets and eliminating the vectors in which malaria can live, which mosquitoes can breed, namely standing still water. They did that in Mexico with rural workers following advice from the government. And the person who ran that program is a dear colleague and friend of mine who's currently a very senior member of the Mexican government. He was brought into the United States Institute of Medicine to present what he'd done, he thought, but they didn't want to hear about it because he came back and he said to me, the deck is stacked here. They're going to approve DDT. I said, oh my God, I can't believe that, because here's what we know about DDT. DDT is associated with low birth weight babies, according to research done by the National Institutes of Environmental Health Sciences. DDT kills adult mosquitoes. It does not kill the larva. It kills the adult mosquitoes. If you have an epidemic of a lethal mosquito-borne disease like dengue or yellow fever or equine encephalitis, where 50% of the people who get it will die, you might need to use DDT as an emergency. But the idea that you should be spraying it, as they will, inside homes in Africa now, in Kenya, I think is a very, very bad idea. We have seen over and over again that when you use DDT to treat mosquitoes and try to prevent malaria, you create resistance to the DDT. We know that DDT has profound effects on hormones. It may be an anti-androgen, it works through very many different ways. The best solutions for malaria involve keeping people out of the areas where the mosquitoes are and using basic hygiene methods with bed nets and removing standing in still water. I'm concerned about the widespread proposals to reintroduce DDT, and I'm not alone in those concerns, but I recognize that there may be some circumstances under which you have to use DDT or other pesticides, but they should be much more limited than what is being proposed right now. I'm very concerned about it. So I think at this point we'll have time for a reception, and I want to thank you for your questions. Thank you.